So without further ado, please help me welcome the moderator for this amazing panel, Ms. Prerna Suri. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing? It's the end of the day, so be happy, and I'll try and make it short and sweet as well. No, I won't. But it's great to see many of you over here. This is day 2. We've been having interesting conversations on all things AI, big data, analytics. What does it all mean for us as consumers, as average people on the street, really? So today's panel is something which is very dear and close to my heart because it resonates with me personally and professionally. Just to lay the context for the panel, my name is Prerna, and I've been a journalist for the last 15 years or so. I've been covering politics, business in some of the world's challenging environments for Al Jazeera, BBC, and Reuters. But this is not about me. This is really about our profession because, as Jose also said, I do feel the pain when I read my Twitter timelines and I see President Trump coming in again and again, talking about fake news and how we all should be shot dead, essentially. So here to talk to us about all this are my fellow colleagues, and I'm very proud of all of them and the work that they've done. Jeremy Wagstaff, who is a consultant with Reuters, and he's done a lot of good stuff on technology in the past few years, sitting from here in Asia. I've also got Kemp here with me, who's the managing editor of CNBC International Digital. And of course, last but certainly not the least, Neel Chowdhury, who is the editor-in-chief and president of Inc. Asia, another publication that I'm a big fan of. So thank you, gentlemen. Let's just deep dive into some of those issues very quickly. And perhaps, Jeremy, we can start with you. When we think about this discourse on fake news, and for members of the audience who are reading news and consuming news, what is fake news, or is this just a construct of President Trump's imagination?
I think a lot of it does exist in the president's imagination, but it does go to deeper concerns and issues within our profession. I think there was a bump when fake news first appeared and when it was realized that only quality publications and news organizations could really tackle this and report things well. But we've seen now that that probably isn't enough in this industry. It's certainly not enough to be able to fund good journalism over the long term. There has to be something more. And I think that it's also rather, and I'm not talking about Reuters here, which is excellent and does everything perfectly, but more generally in news, it's about whether or not you are, as a journalist, completely objective and unbiased. Mm-hmm. And it's particularly at these times where almost not taking sides seems to be a cowardly or the wrong thing to do. But you're only going to have credibility if your output is as objective and unbiased as it can possibly be. This is journalism 101, but I'm afraid, I have a feeling that we've kind of lost it somewhere. We felt that we're in the midst of some existential crisis, political crisis, maybe in a global crisis of credibility and faith in institutions, and journalism being one of them. And I think that we do have to hold ourselves a little bit to account and ask ourselves whether the journalism we've done really matches that yardstick.
Yeah, it's that classic conundrum that, again, what we learn in universities as journalism students, do we be objective or shall we be slightly subjective and err on the wrong side or the right side of history, depending on where you are. But Neel, coming from Inc. As well, and you guys are known for your journalism, which is slightly more catchy, where you do tend to be slightly more opinionated as well. So how do you balance out this whole need for being subjective, yet being objective as well?
Well, I mean, at Inc., we're not a hard news publication, so we're not in the breaking news business. Inc. is it's basically a magazine and a website and overall media product for entrepreneurs. So it's the information that we provide and the stories that we write about is about helping entrepreneurs start a company, grow their companies, and go from good to great. So, but having said all of that, of course, we write stories about specific people, specific companies, specific situations, and so we're held to account in the same way that any other news organization would be about facts and accuracy. My take on fake news is somewhat colored by my deep dislike for Trump, who seems to have sort of popularized the term. So it's often, news that he doesn't agree with, or that's unflattering to him. And what I think, is interesting to me as a sort of a longtime resident of Southeast Asia and a journalist in Southeast Asia for a long time as well, is how, these fake news laws have been promulgated and in the case of Malaysia, passed. And how I think that it's a dangerous trend, because it seems to me another way to control information and basically silence people, or has the potential to do that.
Yeah, and Ted, I think you're in that problematic space as well, where you are running clearly a business news publication platform. So do you have any challenges when it comes to these issues, when it comes to, let's say, sponsorships or advertising? How do you sort of balance the business of the news with the actual news itself?
Yeah, well, I try to stay as clear as possible from the business side at all times. That's the easy answer on that one. I can definitely speak about, fake news, and as Neel was saying about it being sort of its genesis coming from the U.S. I was interim politics section head in the United States during the 2016 election season before I came here, so I was able to see that sort of genesis happen where that was being bandied about. And to speak toward what Jeremy was saying, I do actually think that to some extent it has been instructive for us as a profession, because the best defense against the accusation of putting out fake news is to be bulletproof. I mean, to get your facts straight, to do everything that you can to have that integrity. If we don't have our integrity, we might as well just turn out the lights. We might as well go home, because we're done. That said, no matter what you say, no matter what you put out there in whatever medium, you are going to be accused of being non-objective. You are going to be accused of now fakery by somebody. I'm almost of a mind that if somebody doesn't condemn you, then you've probably done something wrong. So, and so you just got to toughen up. You just got to toughen up and muscle through that.
I think toughening up is a great piece of advice there. But apart from that, what else as journalists can we do to make sure that our Twitter feeds aren't trolled, that our Facebook feeds aren't putting out pictures and threats of our family members out there? And some of the things have actually happened to me as well a couple of years ago while I was covering India and South Asia in particular. So I still sort of ponder on those days and think about what it could have been done from my side. What's that toolkit that journalists actually need? And this is open to anyone on the panel.
Well, I can say that we're actually negotiating that problem, and we'll probably continue to be negotiating that problem for some time. I've had journalists, young writers, who have asked to be removed from certain beats because of how much hate they got on social media. And this wasn't politics. It was actually cryptocurrencies. And there are some seriously partisan people on both sides of the cryptocurrency. Is it worth something or is it not? And it's another one of those things where no matter what, you're going to get hit. And because of the era that we're in and the sort of ubiquity of personal information out there everywhere, they get to you by name. I guess that the way that I'm looking at that now, I'm actually curious what you guys have to say about this one, because I'm taking that one on a case-by-case basis. It's a new world on my side.
Yeah, this is something that actually Thomson Reuters is doing really well, and focusing on the mental health in the workplace, and realizing that stress and things like PTSD can come from all sorts of different areas. We tend to think of it as a sort of a war zone disease, if you like, but actually these things can come from being targeted, and journalists in particular, and in this region in particular, especially places like the Philippines, this is a real danger, and people's safety can be affected, but also just the stress levels within can become unbearable, and it's up to editors and human resources to recognize this and do something about it. But there are some excellent programs in place and being developed, and there's becoming a greater willingness of people to talk about it. I think you're right. I think this is kind of forcing us in a way to toughen up, but it's also forcing us as journalists to become more aware of what our role is, and to try and think about what we're doing and how we're writing. I mean, I'm actually quite conservative on these things in the sense that I don't think journalists' Twitter feeds and even their Facebook feeds should be reflecting a point of view. And I think we as journalists not only should be writing great stories and daring stories, but we should also be conscious of the image or the vapor trail that we leave behind us. And I think anybody should feel that they can come to us with a story and we don't see the political tinge of it. We just recognize whether or not it's a story. And sometimes you've got to write that story and let the chips fall where they may. These stories aren't necessarily going to be ones that are going to kind of benefit the people that you would like it to benefit. But as journalists, this should not be our decision. Our decision should be whether it's a story, and it should be a badge of honor that we can hold in our portfolio stories that have held everybody's feet to the fire. Just as if you're a company's reporter, you shouldn't be too cozying up to the companies you're reporting about, any of them. Similarly, in politics and beyond, you have to make sure that you maintain that proud objectivity, but be aware of the mental consequences sometimes.
I still remember when ISIS came out with those horrific videos just a couple of years ago, and I was working at the BBC here in Singapore. A lot of my colleagues who actually saw the Jordanian pilot video were quite distressed, to be honest, myself including as well. So I think the mental health aspect of journalism is widely neglected, thinking that we do have our war boots on, we've got our flak jackets on, so we are hardened. But I think you're absolutely right, Jeremy, in that sense. I want to talk a little bit about the business of journalism itself. I hate to say this, but are we getting extinct with everything that's out there in the digital realm? And maybe, Neel, you'd like to take this because ink is primarily digital as well.
Yes. I mean, just to add to Jeremy's point about the mental health issues, the mental health of journalists was never great to begin with. I mean, judging from the experience, judging from the colleagues that I had, even in the pre-digital era. So I quite agree with him. It was already a pretty fragile mental health situation, in my view. On the business side of journalism, or digital journalism, if that's your question, those of us who wear a business hat, and including myself, our two biggest concerns or fears when we wake up in the morning are Google and Facebook. So it's very simple. We fear Google because Google has made all information free. And therefore, the bar for charging for information, charging for content, charging for journalism has become ever higher, because when somebody's offering it to you for free and offering it to you in unlimited amounts, it becomes more and more difficult to be a price maker rather than a price taker. We fear Facebook because of what it can offer to advertisers in the form of targeting, which has always been an advertiser's sort of El Dorado, which is to find the person and make sure that the message is reaching that particular person. Quite apart from the issue of whether that person will buy your product, conversion rates with Facebook are actually quite low, and arguably lower than traditional media. But to your point about what we think about in terms of the business model of journalism, these are the two things that I think about the most, certainly.
I think about Google all the time as well because of those very reasons. And whenever I look at the Guardian's news app, which I think is fantastic, and I see that message that, we are a paid news organization, please donate $5, which would translate into a cup of coffee. I don't know how many in the room would actually do that as well. So I think premium journalism comes at a price, and unfortunately businesses aren't really, and consumers also aren't really looking into that. Jeremy, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I mean, part of my job is sort of trying to look over the next kind of few hills, and I recognize the problem. 84% of digital ad spend goes to Google and Facebook. It's painful, but I think that we don't do ourselves any favors, because if you've subscription obviously is another way of doing it, but if you try to subscribe to even some of the top newspapers, that's fine, they'll sign you up. If you try to cancel, it's painful. It's as painful as any divorce. And this really can't happen anymore. The problem is that news is becoming nichified. It's breaking down into ever smaller areas of interest, and that very few of us are going to still be interested in taking everything that the New York Times has to offer.
Yep.
We might be interested in particular articles, or we might be interested in subscription now and again, or we might be interested in just taking the weekend edition. We have got to learn how to better serve those people who are willing to pay for journalism, because we're scaring them off.
Yeah.
We're actually, the tendency now is to feel overburdened with information, even in this era of fake news, or maybe particularly this era of fake news. A recent Pew study showed that nearly 7 in 10 Americans feel overburdened with news information. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of both sides of the house, obviously. So we need to start approaching the dawn which we've long promised and never achieved, which is the ability to have micropayments, or just small payments for pieces of information that you want, and to be able to subscribe and unsubscribe as easily as you can with Netflix. I tried it again today just to check that it was possible, and Netflix you can unsubscribe with just pressing a button.
See?
And that needs to be the gold standard of every news organization that is inviting subscriptions.
Yep.
It also needs to be that everybody who subscribes feels like they are a much loved member of the family. They shouldn't be thrown the same number of ads that everybody else is. The actual money accruing to that person is about $1 a year in terms of advertising. So this person has ponied up, $35 a month for a well-known news service that isn't Reuters. They shouldn't be faced with those self-same ads. Now, I know that this is a story that we've long had to hear about, micropayments. The dawn may be coming close with cryptocurrencies. If all the journalists haven't been hounded into oblivion by the geeks online who set their store by one type or another. But Bitcoin Cash, for example, which is a hard fork of Bitcoin, promises through websites like yours.org to enable very simple micropayments. I don't believe this dawn has actually happened yet, but I believe it's quite close. And I think news organizations should be pushing the envelope here. They should be the ones who recognize that the future is not in people paying for journalism because they like journalism and they want to support it. That is always going to be a very limited subset of readership. But there is a possibility that if we make it easy for people to pay in small amounts as and when they want for information that they want, we might possibly stumble on a new way of funding journalism.
And this is not to name and shame anyone, but how many of you in the audience actually have subscriptions to paid news? Not to name and shame, so please be honest. That's very good. That's actually, I would say, about 40% or 50% of the audience right there. So well done, guys. I mean, you are supporting quality journalism. Although I do see on the screen that someone's asking in the audience that as much as people would like to pay for premium content, and Jeremy, as you just mentioned, people are quite attention deficit. How do you attract readers to a premium news product that they would actually read? And this is open to anyone on the panel.
How do you get people to pay for premium content? Well, one of the ways that you talked about is going niche. And then, of course, you have a limited growth potential because you're looking for a subset of people. Every one of them presents a certain set of challenges. I am actually also intrigued by this idea of blockchain being brought into it. You know, everything that we have changed over the last 15 years has required a radical rethinking. You know, now we know that people don't go into your website through the homepage. The reason we thought they did is because they used to open the newspaper on the front page, but there's no newspaper with the front page anymore, you know, so we have to learn that. So maybe we do have to learn how to like think about in terms of like a la carte, you know, journalism. I think that a really insightful, smart, explanatory journalism can find a paying audience that might be relatively broad because of that very thing that you were discussing a moment ago about people feeling overwhelmed by the amount of information that they get. Part of the reason that people are overwhelmed by the amount of information that they get is a great deal of it is not really information because it doesn't have any context. It doesn't provide you with any meaning or why it matters. It's amazing to me that the industry doesn't recognize this more than it seems to.
But that actually sells, Ted. So we had a discussion yesterday on what goes viral, what content goes viral. And the number of clicks, a YouTube video, let's say 5 million views would be, you know, the pineapple pen video that a lot of people here in Singapore also enjoyed. So you've got that, you know, you've got the eyeballs going over there. And then you also have serious journalism, which let's say a niche audience would enjoy. But how do you then compete within yourselves, right, to make it more meaningful, attractive, and authentic as well for people to actually say, I'm going to pay for that? Maybe I should just answer this question myself.
Yeah, well, I feel that it's long been a bugbear that we as journalists tend to think in terms of news. I mean, that's kind of obvious in a way, but a lot of the time, it's the kind of backstory, it's the context, it's the why is this happening as much as this is happening. It's a very kind of journalistic ethos is to chase the hard news, and that's frankly what our editors get most excited about. And all we do is we kind of build up this huge body of now news, which is almost completely valueless when it's no longer now. And I feel that other people are making interesting inroads into this space. I tend to think of podcasts as really a backstory. Every podcast is a kind of backstory. It's why did this happen? It can be as obscure as a crime that was never solved, or it could be what is going on in DC right now, and it's a discussion. And after listening to that, you understand the context for all the kind of itty bits you're getting on Twitter and on the newspapers or news organizations' websites. And I also think this is a great potential source of monetization. It's just we've never done a really good job of trying to make use of the things that we've already written, which are no longer absolutely contemporary. And I know people have tried to kind of apply AI to this. So we've sort of played around with tagging the data in order to make reuse of it. But I think that it probably requires a rethinking of actually how we organize our newsroom and how we approach news itself in order to be able to provide a better service to readers.
No, I agree. And Neel, maybe, you know, since Inc. is primarily digital, correct me if I'm wrong, how do you utilize data analytics? How do you use data that you get from the readers that are coming to your website? And do you then use that to curate news for them?
Well, we're harvesting analytics all the time through both the site, you know, and the tools that we have that are plugins to the site. But, you know, and we try to learn as much from the audience and their preferences, and, you know, and that inevitably shapes editorial judgments, which I think is fairly standard practice. Going back to what, you know, Jeremy and Ted were talking about, I'm intrigued by the idea of making, you know, journalism more interactive, and interactivity has become sort of an increasingly vacant word, but you know, if you look at, for instance, the gaming industry, which has been so phenomenally successful through companies like Tencent and so on, one of the key features of any game is that they're forcing the user to make decisions all the time. It's a decision-making, a catalyst or mechanism. So a friend of mine was suggesting to me the other day when he's a fan of ink. He said, well, why not put yourself in the position of a reader who is reading about, let's say, one of the people we write about, whether it be Nadeem from Gojek or somebody from one of these startups that we've written about, like Grab or Gojek or and so on, or One Championship. Why not put yourself in their position and see what they would do? Give them a menu of choices, because any entrepreneur faces difficult decisions on an almost daily basis. How do you raise capital? How do you hire people? How do you fire people, etc.
Yep.
So there are ways, I think, that journalism, to remain relevant and engaging, there are ways that it can learn from the multimedia around them, which they have so far sort of tended to ignore, I would say.
And video games also engage in microtransactions.
Yep.
You can, as you're playing the game, you can acquire something that makes you more effective at the game or what have you. Suppose that you've gone through and we're all in business news. Suppose you're going through and you've done a whole ton of research about where Warren Buffett has stood on airlines, year to year over the last 20 to look at trends there. I'm just coming up with something off the top of my head. And you have that at the bottom of the story, and you can plug that in there, and you can offer that to them, maybe for a little something. You know what I mean? I don't know. I'm not saying, hey, this is a great idea, I'm going to run out and do it. But I think that there are things that we can explore that we haven't quite, tested yet.
Just to add to that point, I think what we've probably lost sight of is that people's brains have changed, meaning the way we receive information has changed in the last 20 years thanks to the internet. So we're no longer sort of passive recipients of information in perhaps the way we were 30 or 40 years ago, when people got up and read a newspaper and they would just passively read or absorbed that news or that content. Our brains have changed, have been affected obviously by the technology around us, and it demands different forms of engagement with content.
So then the trick is, of course, how do you balance the needs of having those experiential kind of experiences through the news consumption patterns of your viewers or the people who are actually coming onto your platforms, and that is the tricky bit. But maybe let's talk a little bit about censorship as well, because that's something that was raised by somebody in the audience, so thank you for that. It's a very important point as well. So we're living in an era which, journalists are being targeted from all sorts, from businesses, politicians. Elon Musk as well recently came out with his infamous tweet where he was haranguing journalists as usual. We are the cause of everyone's problems. How do each of you actually cope with censorship issues? Do you believe in the self-censorship model, or do you actually have guidelines talking about it with your journalists and with your staff that these are the do's and don'ts?
Well, every journalism organization that I've worked in, I worked with Jeremy at one,
Yep.
Has standards for reporting and fact-checking and accuracy. Mm-hmm. What I find interesting about censorship is that, traditional media, so-called traditional media, whether it be a TV broadcaster like CNBC or a newspaper like the Wall Street Journal, or even a news agency like Reuters, have always been the subject of prosecution from people who are unhappy with the way they report. And they've often been the subject of lawsuits and so forth. I always find that interesting because we seem to set a different set of standards for digital media, particularly for platform-based media like Facebook, where if you looked at Mark Zuckerberg's testimony before Congress, a few months ago, it was disingenuous how he often said, well, people put terrible things on Facebook, but we can't control it because we're just a platform, you know.
We're a tech firm,
you know,
not a media company, I think.
and
Those
so
were the
therefore we're
words,
not
yeah.
responsible and shouldn't be held liable.
Yep.
I've always found that a fascinating, you know, double standard or inconsistency, if you will.
Are there any Facebook people in the room right now? Not to name and shame them either, but anyway. I think, yeah, censorship is just one of those things, and since you are getting barrage from all sorts of platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and then we've seen the rise of trolls as well, armies of trolls coming up in countries like Russia, you know, in other places as well. How do you cope with that as well, on top of everything else that we've talked about? Let's say somebody doesn't like a story that CNBC's put out about an American company. Do you have any checks and balances in place which helps you filter out hateful comments, hateful authentic comments from the ones which might be coming from other places?
A few years ago, we had comments at the bottom of every story, and now we have comments at the bottom of none. And I used to advise my writers to never read them. I never read them. I certainly never learned anything from any of them. So they weren't doing anything for me. I think that actually the bigger problem is especially when you're part of an international news organization, like I'm working the whole world outside of North America, and you're going to come into a country-to-country censorship. But there, the bottom line is that you can't change what you're doing in order to suit a particular polity or government, I should say. We have, as you alluded to a moment ago, had a recent example here with the now out-of-power regime in Malaysia. It might have made us be that much more careful about what we were saying, that everything was nailed down about Malaysia, because they said it was supranational. They could prosecute people who were not actually in Malaysia at the time. So you know, you cancel vacation plans if you need to. But like, so what we did was we didn't change what we put out. In fact, we put out a large number of stories about that situation and the election, which was of course unfolding at that time, and we got a monster amount of traffic from Malaysia. Because we obviously can see where the traffic is coming from. So we actually, it reaped major dividends. If you're going to censor yourself on something like that, then that's the same as just allowing, just folding, you know? Yeah. I mean, now, China, doesn't matter what we do, they're not going to let us run anything there anyway. So, you know, it's just the type of thing where I think you go forward and you let them sort it out.
Yep. I think censorship is just one of those things where you walk a very, very tightrope on that. I mean, it's a balance between being fair and authentic yet. And of course, Jeremy, you can sort of resonate with that with Myanmar as well and what happened there. But maybe just moving on about the sustainability of the journalism business as well. How sustainable do you think journalism is going to be in the next 20 or 30 years, given all the challenges that we've been talking about? And this is for anyone.
I thought you were going to say the next 20 or 30 months. I was like,
I'm being a fair optimist.
Yeah, I mean, it changes so often and so quickly. One of the things that I've learned, actually only in the last like 5 years or so, is that it's never going to get settled. You know, it used to be like, oh, we're going through a turbulent period with a lot of change, and then we'll get to the new rules. There are not going to be any new rules. It's just going to keep changing. I mean, the technology is so dynamic that it's always shifting. I go through periods where I'm optimistic. I go through periods where I'm pessimistic. At the moment, I'm optimistic because largely, ironically enough, because of the U.S. presidential election, which has, in the United States at least, created a groundswell among regular Americans who are willing to pay for real news. Washington Post is seeing a big uptick. The New York Times is seeing a big uptick. Probably the Wall Street Journal is as well. I don't know that for sure. But so, you know, that makes me feel good that people are engaged and actually seeking out that truth. Ask me how I feel in 12 months, it might be different.
Maybe in 12 days, so that's how the troughs and crests go. What about you guys? What do you think about the sustainability of journalism?
I'm surprised that a lot of us are still here, in the sense of a lot of the news organizations. The big news organizations are still pretty much the same big news organizations. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago whether that would have been the case, I probably would have said no. I do think that it's possibly just a kind of steady decline in some ways of those news organizations. But I do think that both the kind of crisis, particularly of local journalism in US and Europe, Australia and elsewhere, you've seen hollowing out of local newspapers, local publications, and therefore local coverage, and therefore holding local politicians to account. A lot of that is gone, but the appetite for it is still great. I think probably news organizations need, and this is part of my previous answer about kind of fixing the monetization, they need to fashion a closer relationship with their readers and acknowledge that actually the kind of readers are, in a sense, the providers. Up until now, we've tended to view comments as a kind of necessary evil or ban them entirely when they get completely out of hand. And even in the old days when I used to handle some of the letters to the editor of the journal, and it was okay for a while as long as the guy didn't write too many letters, and then we would just conclude the discussion. This is not the way to hold a conversation with the people who are buying your product. And I think news organizations need to understand that better, and understand too that, going back to the blockchain model and the idea of being able to pay with cryptocurrency through micropayments, we're going to see peer-to-peer journalism take place, where I fund you because I understand that you know the subject far better than anybody else. I'm willing to give you $100 to go and spend a week, and maybe another 100 people the same to go off and report that out and come back and tell me something. And I think that journalists, we still have the habit of placing ourselves in these ivory towers, looking down upon people and doing great journalism and then bringing it like some special gift to the people. And it's true that journalism is extremely difficult, and it destroys marriages and turns us all to drink and gives us PTSD, etc.
Yep.
But we still need to recognize that the people we're writing for, the people we're making content for, are people who want to have a discussion with us, just as the questions are coming up now.
Yep.
They want to have a discussion with us, and we should be part of that discussion. And in a way, the funding might emerge organically from that.
Yep.
And whether it's big organizations doing that or very small ones, I think this is where the longer-term future will lie.
Yeah, I really like your idea about this peer-to-peer journalism network, if that does happen on the blockchain, because that will change a lot of things. And that's what one of the questions also is being posed by the audience. What current journalism innovations do each of you admire, and what are those?
Sorry?
Are there any innovative products in journalism that you're seeing right now, which, for instance, Jeremy talked about the peer-to-peer crypto exchange journalism network. Is there anything else that you guys are looking out for in the next big thing in journalism?
Well, I would love to say yes, but I think there will be all sorts of micro solutions. Mm-hmm. But as a former, I'm still a business journalist, but I was more actively so a few years ago. What I'm struck by is the monotony of the issues that keep coming up, meaning we're still talking about the same problems that we were talking about 10, 15 years ago in terms of paywalls. Does the subscription model work? How do you make advertising work, and with the onslaught of Facebook or programmatic advertising? And the debate just keeps going on and on and on without, it seems to me, any satisfying conclusion. If I were a media reporter today, I would be, hard pressed to come up with new stories, because it seems like it's the same story again and again and again. So I guess my answer is I don't know. I think there are those models out there, but I think the fundamental issues, the fundamental problems, partly to do with Google and Facebook, have not been resolved.
But let's say Google and Facebook, if they didn't exist, would we still exist? For me, that's the existential crisis that I face. That is our journalism good enough for us to be engaged with the people who are actually wanting to know more about the world, sitting from where they are? But I understand your perspective. I think debate about revenues and subscription models and the business of journalism. I've been seeing that from my university days many years ago as well. So maybe just as a quick wrap up, because I'm mindful that we're almost out of time, one challenge and one opportunity that each of you can share about journalism. And starting with you, maybe Neel.
Sure.
Just one challenge and one opportunity in journalism.
I think we've talked a lot about the challenges. You know, my father was a journalist, so the one lesson that I took away from his life was, and I don't often apply this, but is to have a lot of fun, because it's a very fun job, and I don't feel like I have enough fun. So if you're a journalist, that would be my advice to you: have fun.
Nice, I like that.
I'm excited about trying to explore new forms of journalism, of trying to get rid of the traditional way of writing, of presenting, radio, TV, and just doing straightforward text journalism. We're still wedded to a format which doesn't serve the age, doesn't serve the attention economy well. And I think the areas I'm most excited about actually are podcasts, in that people commit themselves to listening to sometimes 2 hours of somebody talking, which is very exciting. It kind of allows, one journalist described it to me as, it allows a story to breathe. You're trying to find a personal relationship with the person you're interacting with and telling the story to, and this opens up whole new possibilities for the way that we convey our news and the way we think about our news. Instead of us thinking about our news as broadcast, it's now much more of a narrowcast approach, where we're talking almost to individuals and bearing those people in mind when we're writing and researching that story, in order to engender understanding, to build atmosphere, and to provide that broader context, which hopefully will broaden our minds rather than narrow them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that there's a number of challenges, obviously, but one that comes to mind immediately is we have to work hard to continue to teach younger journalists who are, as they say, digital native, to still report from outside of their computers, and to not be so deeply engaged in that digital realm that they, for example, don't want to write anything or do a video about anything until they see confirmation from someone else on Twitter or what have you, which is so immediately right there in front of you. You know, we used to go much more with our faith and what we have been able to discover. Now I think that there's a tendency, and the tendency is there because it's easy, extraordinarily easy, to just go online and say, well, let's see what FT's saying, let's see what SJ is saying, okay, I feel confident that it's right, you know, and we've got to, for two reasons. First of all, well, three reasons. First of all, that's how you do good journalism. Secondly, that's how you differentiate yourself. And thirdly, we owe it to those young reporters to make them journalists. So we have to put that time in to give them, it's really about giving them the confidence. Because I remember when I was a young reporter, it scared the hell out of me to go and walk to a stranger and interview them on the street. But you gain that confidence over time, and I think we have to just sort of push them a little bit and keep them doing that.
No, I think that's great, and we're almost out of time. The key takeaways from me from this session have been that journalism, although we're in a bit of a tricky tightrope right now, we're still here. We're still focusing on good journalism, original journalism. There are lots of you out there who love and subscribe to the work that we do, so thank you for that. And have fun while we're doing it. So thank you very much, everyone. That was very insightful. Thank you to my panelists, and thank you to all of you. Thanks. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.